Today's date is December 23rd, 1996. The survivor being interviewed is Sonia Vanderhorst, her birth name Teichholz. The interviewer is Beth Wainwright. The interview is being conducted in Olean, New York, United States of America, in English. Today's date is December 23rd, 1996. This is survivor Sonia Vanderhorst, her birth name Teichholz. My name is Beth Wainwright, W-A-I-N-W-R-I-G-H-T. This interview is being conducted in Olean, New York, in the United States, in English. Can you please tell us your complete name?
My name now?
Yes.
Sonia Vanderhorst, spelled small v a n space d e r space capital h o r s t.
Can you tell me your birth name and spell it, please?
My birth name is my father's name was Naftali, N-A-F-T-A-L-I, Teichholz, T-E-I-C-H-H-O-L-Z. My mother's name was Chava, C-H-A-V-A. It is comparable to Eve in English, Eichenbaum, spelled E-I-C-H-E-N-B-A-U-M.
Okay, and what was your first name when you were born?
When I was born, it was Clara. I don't know why with the Eichenbaum went Chaya, what the reason for it was, but in all my high school years, I was known as Chaya Eichenbaum.
Could you spell that, please?
Chaya, C-H-A-J-A. The reason for the mother's name was because in Poland the religious ceremonies were not recognized, and those were the only ones that basically mattered in the Jewish community. I don't even know whether it was possible for Jews to have a civil ceremony, and if that would have been recognized. So as a result, most of the children were based by standards of today, it would be practically counted as bastards or so, because you went by your mother's name, or anyway, many of the children. I don't know how it happened with other people, but this is in my case.
And what was your birth date?
My birth date, and even that I'm sort of mixed up, because there was a difference between the time I was born and the time my parents got ready to register me. As far as I know, it's either 16 November or 16 December. I do celebrate 16 December for years now, so that's the way I'm going to let it stand.
And what year was that?
That was in 1923.
And how old are you today?
I'm today 73 years old.
Okay, thank you. Could you tell me about if you had any siblings?
Yes, I had one sister about 10 or 11 years younger than I, called Malka, M-A-L-K-A. That's just one sister.
Can you remember your grandparents?
Yes, I remember both sides of my grandparents. I just remember the name of one of my grandparents, and that's on my mother's side, Schmerl Eichenbaum. Schmerl, and Eichenbaum is previously spelled. The others, I have their faces in front of me, but I don't remember the names.
And where were you born?
I was born in Ternopil, Tarnopol.
What country is that in?
That was in Poland, and then of course when the Russians came in, then it became Russian, and then it was overrun by the Germans. So it was occupied first by the Russians and then overrun by the Germans. And now it's back to Ukraine. It isn't anymore Russian. As far as I remember, it belonged, when my mother was young, I think it belonged to Austro-Hungarian Empire. And that was, I think, the reason why a lot of people spoke very good German, you know, because the education at that time, you know, included German. And so I think that's as far as I remember my mother explaining it.
And where is Tarnopol near? What major city would that be near?
That would be, that what used to be called Lvov, but now apparently it's since under Ukraine, it's changed to Lviv, somebody said. Lviv, but it used to be Lvov during the Poles, which is LW. O is a kind of like umlaut, and LW.
Can you tell me about your earliest memories of you and your family?
I've tried to think about it, whether it goes as far as 3 years old or a little bit later or so. My earliest remembrance is of starting my Hebrew education, which was, in that I can't remember whether it's 3 or 5 or 6 years. What I generally remember is basically the Jewish community was a totally, without the ghetto walls that came later, or so, it was a totally self-enclosed community. Practically, not completely, but I would say at the optimistic side, 75% separated from the Poles and the occasional Ukrainians there. We had a Ukrainian dome-type church, and the majority were, of course, Poles, Roman Catholic. My earliest remembrance are of a totally hostile environment, where all the nurturing and all the strengths that I ascribe to part of to my survival came within the family. My whole family on both sides, they both lived in Ternopil. So there were lots of cousins, both sides of grandparents, uncles, and a lot, and you know, like the Jewish holidays, and aside from the holidays, you know, you just kind of visited, you came to your grandmother's for some warm soup in a cold winter, the usual thing, but all this was just totally within the family. The hostile environment must have made an enormous impact on me, because I feel that somehow my resentment towards the Poles is much greater than my resentment towards the Germans.
Before we get into that, could you just elaborate a little more on your family? What did you mean by the community and the family was self-contained?
The whole social interchange was totally within the Jewish community. So, anything which was any holidays or anything, everything was within the family and within the friends, either from the synagogue or from the Hebrew school, or so. I mean, you basically felt separate from the outside environment. I suppose the best maybe comparison, I don't know whether it's the right one, but I'm just kind of trying to search for it, would be maybe just like the blacks in the United States. There was basically no interchange, or the interchange was just about, mailing a letter or, this sort of thing, or needing stamps or permission for something. But there was an enormous amount of nurturing, or at least in my case. I don't want to make all Jewish families in there as if, there were no stupid or no fat or no, mean people. People like other people, but in my case, it was a very nurturing environment, and all the security I received is by knowing how much I mattered to my parents.
Tell me about a holy day with your family. Tell me about Sabbath.
My mother used already, I think she must have gotten at 4 o'clock in the morning on Friday morning, because I know that by the time I left, probably our school started 8:30. I can't remember exactly, and I had to walk at about probably at 7:30 or something. Then all most of the fresh baked goods were already baked. Obviously the traditional challah, which, she baked herself. And then, there were sweet things. One of the things, like my father, did not care for very sweet things. So she made either a honey cake or what do you call it here, pound cake, a white pound cake, or either a honey cake. Then there was the dough that you spread with butter in order to get the layers. What do you call it here? I forgot. So all this, was baked. Then, on Friday night, my father used often to go to not a steam bath, but something like that or so. So, before, he would often go to a steam bath, and it was all the sort of preparation for the Sabbath. And then when the prescribed time came, and all the cooking went, the usual gefilte fish and the chicken soup and chicken and whatever meat, and so. So when I'm trying. So my father, after that, he would go to the synagogue, and then when he came back, you know, this part I'm sort of mixed up whether the candles were lit before he left or after he left. Somehow that, you know, and then we would sit down and have, you know, a meal. There was a very sense of sanctity about it. And I remember, you know, I of course was young, and so I was supposed to be in a prescribed time at home, and I didn't come back one Friday exactly on time, and my father was very upset, and I really worshipped my father. And then the second Friday, I didn't come either back. Not on time. I came, of course, back, but not on time. And the third Friday, and my father, who never my parents never hit us, son, he just kind of hit me on the face. And I remember I started considering committing suicide, because I thought that was the worst thing that ever happened to me, or so. So I received enormous sustenance from my family and friends and in general, but I was always aware of the hostile environment. And as a matter of fact, even though I forgot so many things, as I mentioned, including my grandparents' names and cousins' names and things, I remember that, even though I digress, and I will kind of go back to it, but sort of apropos seems to me, that when the Germans entered and when the first few days were such a carnage, one of the girls I was in the gymnasium with, she said, "This is what I've been waiting all along."
She was Polish.
Yes, she was Polish, and I will never. And that was just the kind of culmination of the reason I'm bringing it up is that it gives you, I hope it gives you this sense of the terrible animal. I felt this is a terrible thing to feel, because I was raised in a highly ethical way. My father always used to say, you know, your word is your bond. And my friends here in Orient know that if I say something is so, it means that's the way it was. And I have complete trust from the community and friends here, and knowing that you know, that you are raised that way. And I remember, like, for instance, let's say you have here the 4th of July, so there is a parade or something. And we were supposed from the school, from the gymnasium, we were supposed to be in the parade. There was, you know, like a command performance or so. And there were always signs also, Jews to Madagascar, you know, this kind of thing.
Is the gymnasium a state school?
Yes.
So you attended a state school with Poles?
Yes.
Can you tell me about school?
Well, in school, like for instance, there were, like you have the Girl Scouts or so, and now is it like, for instance, in lower grades, what is it here, Girl Scouts, it continues in Poland, it continued in high school too, You know, Jewish girls were not welcome. Nobody even would have dreamt of applying. It was one of those, if you want to put it in terms of United States, like a gentleman's agreement or an anti-Semitic agreement or so, but it never even entered anybody's head. So you, for instance, you were in a class and you heard girls say, oh yeah, you know, we have a meeting this afternoon or whatever, you know, we're going to, but that was totally amongst themselves. We wouldn't even have dreamt of applying, and the thing was unheard of, you know.
How many Jews were in your school, would you say?
Well, the classes were divided in German meaning German classes, meaning that the foreign language was either German or French. There were like maybe six Jewish girls in a class of 40 or 46 or so in the German, and I think 4 in the French. I happened to be in the French one, so you know, actually, you know, you in a sense, you had your good times, obviously. You know, I love, as I mentioned to you, so I love to dance, I love to play cards, but everything was dampened by this, as I say, hostile environment, because since a young child, you were and had to be aware for your mental survival at that time. How are you going to make it? How are you going to make it? And at that time, there was not a question so much of physically, but how are you going to make a living? How are you because they didn't take Jews to work in the post office. You couldn't be a teacher. There were 2 Jewish teachers in a town of, 36 or whatever. That's a lot. That was like the most prized position, or work for the post office, to have the security of no matter how modest income it was, but to know that there is going to be income that you can count on, that was, something absolutely prize-worthy. But within that, you tried to get education, you had to be, and you were raised to know that there is, you can't count on anything fair. So don't start kind of thinking, don't come with complaints, well, but it's unfair, because that makes as much sense, that just didn't make sense within the context of this existence. You had, in order to even aspire to some possibility in getting admitted to school or so, you had to be better at any time. Equal means not good, because nothing is equal. So all this, it might sound, I suppose it's kind of latent resentment of the burdens that I felt from the outside world. But let us not think that I didn't have happy times, because, the Jewish kids, went out together and congregated and were in each other's houses and laughed and had jokes, and so it's just that this was something like black molasses. It was always there, and if you were wise or so, you just, first as a child, you were aware of it. later on, as growing up or so, you knew you had to take it into account for the future.
What did your father do for a living?
My father had a shoe store, and also in the winter sold barrels of herring.
Did he sell to non-Jews also, or just Jews?
I don't know, to tell you the truth. I remember just seeing the Jews. He had a place where he stored that, but I remember, but whether, something tells me just to the little, stores, Jewish stores. But,
can you tell me about the part of town that you lived in? Can you describe it?
Yeah, originally, when I think maybe until I was 3 years, but maybe I can't remember. We lived in a very good part of town, in sort of the top-notch street or so. And then I remember we had to move, and we came down considerably in our standard of living.
Why did you have to move?
I think the reason we had to move, I'm trying to work that I think it was, maybe I was even older, I don't remember exactly, but I think it was from the General Depression. That those were maybe the Depression years, because all of a sudden I remember we had to move, and we lived in a lovely apartment with big rooms. I still remember it. And my grandfather, Schmerl, then owned an apartment house where he lived in, and we moved into one of those apartments. And that was close to the Rinnek. Rinnek spelled R-Y-N-E-K, and I don't remember the street exactly, but it was close to like a town square. So that's the neighborhood we then lived, which was quite a bit lower, which was not poor, but quite a bit lower from what it was before. But when I went to the gymnasium or so, I already lived there, and I remember also walking from there to the grade school. But when exactly we moved, I don't remember.
Okay. We're going to stop the tape now and start another one.
Okay.
This is an interview with Sonia Vanderhorst. This is tape 2. Can you begin to tell us, you were telling us that you felt immense hostility from the Poles as growing up as a child. Tell me about, as a teenager in the gymnasium, can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, basically, there was nothing to do about it. So you lived with it, but you didn't concentrate, or I didn't concentrate on it. I suppose others the same way, it just, you felt it in the air, and that was, I think, that was very destructive for my mental well-being. Feeling that way all your life. So that is the part like for instance, I remember these things when Christmas time came, then I remember my mother saying, remember, it's Christmas. The connotation was no American could possibly imagine that. So I have to explain a little bit. The connotation was those are dangerous times, remember, don't be too much on the street, and certainly for boys. So, there were always some stabbings. There was also, we were the Christ killers. That was emphasized, Nobody ever emphasized. I was talking to a friend of mine, a non-Jewish friend of mine. I don't know how the conversation came up. And I said, nobody ever emphasized that all 12 of them were Jewish, including, as I say, the main man. And I said, from where I stand from where I come from, from my standpoint of view, 1 in 12, if there is a betrayal, 1 in 12, I think that's a very good percentage average from where I stand from. So, but that was that around Easter time was always, that we are going to slaughter a Christian child and put the blood in the matzah. And these things are revived today. They are revived all over again. So, anyway.
Did you ever witness any acts of violence against Jews during those times?
No, but there were always, you heard, well, this one was, and there was, in the paper, like at the university in Warsaw or so, but always a few stabbings. There was in the paper about it. And, did I personally and somebody in my family get beaten up or so? No. But you always had to be careful. You didn't go too much. You didn't. You just withdrew for about 3 days.
What about the police, the government? Were these sanctioned acts, or were they?
I don't. Those are. I'm trying to sort of think how it. I don't think nobody would come to the help. That was just sort of, no Jew would counter on it.
So you couldn't call the police for help?
No,
ever?
I never remember. Whatever went on in the ghetto, there was, stealing, and it was the same way like in any community. Nobody would dream of calling the police.
Okay, you mentioned a ghetto. Could you tell me what you mean by that?
You mean, you mean in connection with the pre-war life?
You just said the word ghetto for the first time in the interview. Could you tell me?
The official ghetto was established after the Germans invaded. That was the official ghetto.
What year was that?
That was in 1941. They established the official ghetto. What that involved is taking part of the city in assigning certain amount of streets to the Jews, which meant any Jews who lived outside the officially prescribed streets had to move out from where they were and find some lodgings within the ghetto. And that, of course, was an enormous upheaval. People had some in bigger apartments, some in the houses, whatever you needed to move out. And then you had to find, and it certainly wasn't, so it was very, very difficult. Plus, first when the Germans came in first, those were the first few days. You see the troops marching in, the SS in the forefront or so. And the first, I would say, maybe 4, maybe 5 days or so was just random killing in the Jewish quarters. This, you know, obviously, or not obviously, but to me obviously, in Poland, and I think generally in Europe, only Jews were circumcised. So anybody who was not Jewish wasn't circumcised. So the simple thing of verifying whether somebody was a Jew, unless he wore a long beard and like the super Orthodox here, totally obviously, you know, with long side locks or so, then you knew, but the others which were shaven or something, you might not know. So the best way is to get them into a door of an apartment house or whatever, also have them drop the pants, and that was the end of it. So that was the first thing that happened, and that, of course, I saw. There was also a lot of rape. I know a girl who lived across the street, and though I was sophisticated in or maybe it's the word sophisticated isn't the right word. I was sort of knowledgeable in ways of the world, sexually or otherwise. I didn't even know exactly what the rape was or so when I heard, you know, my parents and some neighbors speaking about the girl that they started, you know, searching houses and so. And then the structure of the ghetto started, and that is when indeed the streets were assigned, so you had to scramble to get something. As it happened, my parents and both of my grandparents and let me see, I think one of my uncles lived outside the prescribed ghetto zone, and I think he left Ternopil, and he had a brewery in a small town someplace, and he and his family went there. But two of my mother's brothers and one of my father's brothers were in the prescribed zone, so we could stay. The only thing happened, like my grandmother on my father's side had an apartment house across from us, and that's what she lived on, because they were one of the few Jews who owned land, because you were not allowed to own land, but they were a few Jews, one of the few Jews who owned land. But my grandfather had asthma, and they wanted to move in a bigger city where the doctors would be available. So they bought an apartment house, which they rented apartments and lived in one of them and lived off the income. And the Germans burned that apartment house. And I remember, by that time my grandfather was dead already, but she had a daughter.
How did your grandfather die? Do you remember?
I think a natural death. It was, I think, during the war, but a natural death.
This was
But maybe it was before the war already. It's possible that before the war. Yeah, because she wouldn't otherwise have died. No, it must have been before the war.
This was 1941 when the Germans first came, and you
yes,
were, how old were you?
I was, I'm born in 23, so what would that make me? Let me see.
18 maybe? Just about 18.
Yeah, something like that, yes. So...
What was the reaction among your family to this, the first incoming of Germans?
Well, you know, nobody expected anything like gas chambers and things like that. Not at all. We of course had the radio on all the time, you know, kind of listening with the Germans, you know, coming in. Plus, there was a fight between the Russians and the Germans, and as a matter of fact, the building where my parents and I lived, that was hit, you know. There were some, you know, there were damage to the building. So there was fighting between the withdrawal of the Russians and the arrival of the Germans. Let me see. So all these people needed all of a sudden to move, but basically for us, for my, for one, my grandmother and my grandfather on my mother's side, and we were in the right building, but my grandmother on my father's side, the building was burned. And they walked over, she and her daughter, across the street to us, and I remember this, you know, if you could be a photographer or a painter, you could really, this terrible sorrow, seeing all kind of disappear out of just wanton destruction without, but I now remember your question. What it was, we never expected this kind of carnage, and there was an enormous bewilderment. There was fear, and basically the options were, there were no options. You know, I remember, for instance, my father always would have liked to go to Israel, what at that time was Palestine, and so. But you needed, in order to go there, you needed like 30,000 zloty, which is was the currency in Poland. Well, 30,000 zloty was like $30,000, you know, let's say. It wouldn't be an official exchange, but nevertheless I would compare to that. So for people with our means, that was absolutely impossibility. So you really couldn't do anything. So that was, so you just waited, and in the meantime, you know, you talk, other people, you know, wanted, you tried to help and see whether you knew somebody who had some space and they could come in. So that's how it, once that was organized, and it's sort of, if you want to put it in a kind of ironic way, the infrastructure for the what was supposed to come was set into place, then it became kind of a, you felt it became an organized thing. So basically there were the ghetto was enclosed, so there were wooden gates with sentries. And of course, we all had the yellow patch, the yellow things that we wore around our arms, you know. And this was you were not allowed to take it off on penalty of death, and so you at all times were supposed to wear those armbands. Is that what you call it in English too? Because armbands, yeah. So you had to wear it. One was terribly protective of the man because you needed, sometimes you needed something. One tried to not to send the man outside at all, Of course, living became very precarious because you couldn't make a living. So it became a question, that somebody had, it was winter, somebody had boots, and maybe somebody else, got some place from somebody, a non-Jew, or some flowers, or you traded, but it was really a very limited thing, and it became everything became a problem. So any time you had you couldn't just leave the ghetto. You had to have a good reason why you left the ghetto. So now I managed to secure a job with some German officers, which came together with the occupation forces, and they were kind of like the administration. They were not the fighting like the SS or so. They were the administration, and they took over some quarters of sort of the hotel in Ternopil, and there was a hotel and a restaurant, but they took over the first story or whatever it was, and they needed somebody for cleaning and somebody for cooking. And some gal who I didn't know, but I came to know later, she was married, and she did the cooking and I did the cleaning. And there were, I think, 3 officers and a quote-unquote secretary. I said, I think now that she probably did more than just being a secretary. But anyway, whatever it was a very good position. It got me out of the ghetto, and officially I had the papers. Plus, I made friends is too strong a word, but I got to know the man who took care of the restaurant supplies, which in the restaurant used to be a very good restaurant, and it still got supplies even though things were tight, because it was frequented now by Germans and the kind of the upper echelon now, and so I used to get like every second day from whatever I exchanged or however my parents got some money, a loaf of bread, which at that time, the Bible says bread is the staff of life. At that time it was 2 staffs or whatever. In the meantime, because it was now everything, if you want to put it that way, routine, and the Germans, of course, knew that there are plenty Jews. Not the movement on the streets wasn't. People tried to limit their going out on streets. They also received some cooperation from the Jewish. They wanted a list of Jews, in the ghetto, of all the Jews. And the idea was there was like a council, Jewish council, and they were, asked to give the names. And, they did give the names, so that was, they had names of people. There also developed a Jewish sort of militia, they called them, and they like patrolled the streets. So on a regular basis, they organized what they call actions.
Who organized?
The Germans. organize what they call actions. Sometimes it happens when they decided to again to make the ghetto smaller, so eliminate a few extra streets from the ghetto, so then the people who lived in the streets outside the ghetto needed again to find room to stay, and then of course they were on the street, and then the Gestapo or so would come very often on horses, and they organized what it calls action, round up the people on the street, at the same time went, searching the houses, and everybody, tried to do some in the basement, kind of a false thing, some like a false door, but they would go and find some people, and some of them would be taken, some would be, depending on what hit this Gestapo guy or something, some would be shot right then and there, some would be just brought to that square where, I lived not too far away, and, and then they were probably some maybe to mass graves right there, and you heard next day somebody would be talking or so, that some were taken, outside of town to a mass grave and shot, some probably, like in the case of my mother, that happened on one of those actions where we needed to evacuate our apartment, and my mother said to me, why don't you go and try to get permission, because you needed then the papers or so, and I would go looking for the apartment. And when I was on the street, like maybe for 10 minutes, so all of a sudden you hear the galloping of the horses and kind of this. And I right away realized that was action, and I scooted into a first door of an apartment house, and people were scrambling to go in down the basement, and I went with them, and there happened to be also by accident a younger girl whom I knew, was not a friend, but I knew of, and I knew not very well, and we found ourselves there in this basement, and before you knew, you heard the marching of the boots, and them ransacking the house, and lo and behold, they found us. They moved, whether it was a stone or whatever, if you wanted, you could find it. Certainly you needed to get into that basement, so it wasn't anything sophisticated. Anyway, they found us, and they started, moving us out, of the basement. And some people, everybody had you had a gold bracelet, or you had, necklace or something. You tried to bribe them or so, but they didn't need to be bribed because they go and get it anyway. So to make a long story short, they all, went upstairs, and I was kind of left with this gal my age, a little bit younger, and one there were two guys, so one was shooing everybody out, and the other then stayed behind, and he said, now you, and I said, oh no, I'm not going any place. You want to do it right here and now, but I'm not going upstairs, and I'm not going again. So this other gal got sort of panicky and went out, and she did survive, I hear that, so whether she's now still alive, I don't know, but anyway, so I was left with the guy, and the basement had like support, beams and so, but as far as I remember, it was wood, and I kind of held on to one, and he hit me in the head, and I sort of hit the beam, and he said, "Raus," and I said, "Not going." Just, I sort of, what I counted on is that it's one thing to fire on a multitude. And I thought, I want him just to be he and I at my age. And he fired a gun at me. I wanted up front. And he didn't. So I then things after a while, you know, I whether I spend the night and the next day when you didn't hear any more noise, you know, like once ear gets accustomed to the type of noises which are associated with action or something, or, you know, ordinary living sort of occupations. And so I came out, and when I came out, somebody told me that my father and my sister were shot.
How old was your sister at that time?
Let me see, she must have been, since I was, what are we talking now, about 42. Yeah, we're talking 1942. So she must have been what, maybe, let me see, she was 1942, I was what, 17, 18, 19 years. So she was 10 years younger than I. So she was shot. You know what always amazed me in how the children were quiet, the small children, so 4, 5, 6, you know, they somehow, I was always amazed in it. And another thing that always amazed me is, you know, how you never know how somebody is going to react, because there was another action, and that was before the one that my mother was gone, but I remember another action. And we were someplace in our basement, and there were little windows, and you heard the Germans, you know, walking with the heavy boots, you know, and I heard one say to the other in German, the beautiful woman from the next building or whatever, she went because of her child. And I remember when I knew her, it was not somebody I knew very well, was a beautiful girl, was married relatively early, which wasn't usual in our circles, and so, and had a child, and always seemed to me sort of empty-headed, but it was obviously a total misjudgment, because she simply, they wanted to let her go, apparently, because from the conversation that I overheard the two Germans.
This is an interview with
Sonia?
Sonia Vanderhorst. This is tape 3. You were, if we may just go back for a minute, I just wanted to ask you, you mentioned that you got papers to work outside of the ghetto. Could you tell me where you got those papers and how it came to be that you got them?
I don't remember, but whether I went, how I got the first time out of the ghetto in order to see where I can get a job, the details of it I don't remember. I just remember, you know, I suppose it's the same thing as happens with me now too. You know, I remember just the important thing. The important thing was to get a job outside the ghetto, which would provide a modicum of freedom of movement, and also some income, and of course that bread was, so that's what I remember. How I came out the first time, and how whether I decided just that maybe in a restaurant would be a good way to work, and I went to the restaurant and they didn't have or were not allowed to hire me and suggested go upstairs, there are these German officers, but that I couldn't say for sure.
Now, your father's store, what had happened to it at this
Oh,
time?
that nobody did, that was, I don't even remember, I think he probably lived of some of the shoes that still, kept selling for and exchanging for something, but until everything was gone, I suppose, that was, I suppose it was advantageous to have something like shoes, a certain amount of time, so that was about that. Of course, you have to remember that in the first part, from 1939 to 1941, the Russians came in, and I don't know whether you're interested in that part at all, or that is basically not germane to this interview.
We are interested in it.
You are
Yes.
interested in it, okay, because you see, first the Russians came in, and of course everything I still went on to school under the Russians for 2 years, or practically 2 years, and that is because the Russians dissolved like the Polish state schools, and organized, whether it was schools more along where, let's say, the community was, like you have here in the United States. You have school here, a school there, but it was already taught. First of all, the state school that I went to, the boys and girls were separated. So mine was a totally girls' school, the gymnasium I went to. They right away made it co-educational. Also, the Russian language was added as not as an elective, like, but you had to learn Russian. So you had to learn the Russian alphabet and everything, and you went regularly to school. Now, by the same token, for instance, you were supposed to keep the stores open on Saturdays. Now, even though my father wasn't as super Orthodox as my grandfather, he was still Orthodox. Let's say in Poland on Saturday, I did not go to school. So I always had to make up, if necessary. If you went, I can't remember whether we went on Saturday school, whether we went half a day or something on Saturday. I think maybe we went half a day. But I remember, not going, having to make up things in the holidays or something like that. Well, with the Russians, since religion was out, then that was it. So stores were supposed to be open and everything. Well, my father was one of those people, he just wouldn't. So as a result, he couldn't get any job. And basically, private stores became, to a certain degree, illegal. So, this created a real big problem, because he wouldn't even apply for something else job, because it would involve working on Saturdays, and no way would he want to do that. I think I don't, let me put it this way, I think it created some tensions between my mother and father. It wasn't in a word tension, but obviously I felt it because he just wasn't going to bend. So that was so, then the selling started already then, the selling of our possessions in order to live on it. As it turned out, it didn't matter one way or another because, you know, but so I wouldn't be, I'm sure, you know, that some of the shoes already started being sold just simply to live on and continued.
So by the time you got to the ghetto, there was not that much left of his business.
No, I don't think so, because it already started then.
Now, if I may interrupt,
yeah,
you were telling
bet.
us before how your father and your sister were taken during that accident and shot. Were you present when this happened?
No, because you know, I told you, you know, I was in one building. I went right away when you hear shots or so. You just start running where you belong. You just try to disappear from the street, you know. So I went and so it just. People told me, and there were people in the Jewish community who've always taken care of bodies and, you know, and they, you know, so I never saw my father or my sister dead. And I came back, which was, I can't remember whether it was one night stayed in that other apartment house or 2 nights, but they were gone and my mother was gone. And there was kind of like a second cousin or cousin once removed, 2 women, and they were willing to take me in. And I went in. Now, there is a big part in my life where, or maybe not a big part, but I remember when I worked on a big farmer's estate. It was like somebody like with a count or somebody, the Polish count or something, but who had an awful lot of land, and that land needed to be worked, and he had an overseer.
And when was this?
And that was, and I can't remember whether that was before the last action or after the last action, that I lost the job with the German officers, that maybe they had a decree that they couldn't anymore employ anybody from the ghetto. And then how I found that job in Berezovica on that farmer's on the farm. It was like, as I say, it was a nobleman's estate, and so lots of acreage. Or whether I worked there, I have a feeling that it was after I worked for the German officers and after my parents were killed, that even though they offered me the place, that I still was there in Berezovica for a while and worked on a farm.
And where is this farm located?
Berezovica, B-E-R-E-Z-O-W-I-C-A.
This is in Poland?
In Poland, not too terribly far from Ternopil, but obviously, you know, big land estates, so, you know, not in the city time. And so I worked there for a while, and there, you know, you already lived in barracks because there were other Jews working there too. And at a certain point, first, as long as the Polish supervisor was there, he was a nice guy, and he was all right. But then they sent in a German supervisor. And he seemed all right, but it turned out that one time I went to ask for something or I needed something, and he took up with a Ukrainian girl who, you know, just anyway ended up that he whipped me, and I never even went to the barracks for any of my clothes or anything. I just left, you know, and some way it seemed to me I came back to Ternopil and stayed with these two second cousins for a while. In the meantime, there were already quite, between what I'm telling and the last action where my father and mother and sister were killed, there were some other actions happening, so the ghetto was totally diminished, you know. It was out of maybe 20,000, maybe 500 were left. So obviously you didn't need to be a mathematical genius to figure out that this is the last thing. And I started thinking what I could do. It seems to me there was a friend who she's still living, she's in Minnesota, and it seems to me that she said she had a boyfriend that they are going to try, and when the slave labor trains, which were taking the Russians for slave labor to Germany, that she said, you know, I think I'm going to try that. And that was kind of it. Well, I started talking about it. I started thinking about it, and I thought, you know, this doesn't seem to be a bad idea. It seemed practically like the only, you know, thing left to do. I didn't have anything myself. It was, of course, by now was a very difficult thing because I didn't have any more permission to leave the ghetto. So how I left it, I don't know whether somebody showed me or whatever, whether there was how I evaded the sentries that guarded the ghetto, I can't remember. I just remember that in the morning, you know, and I heard that those trains are coming through Ternopil in the morning or so. So I remember going there, and you know, you had to mill around on the train station without your yellow band, and that was of course extremely nerve-wracking and dangerous. So I went, and that day nothing came. I could see some Jews working on the railroad there, you know, as kind of ghetto workers from the ghetto. I didn't see the train. So I back to the ghetto, and you know, and next day I did the same thing, and again, you know, and it was all very, very hard. The third day I came, and I was ready to give up when all of a sudden I heard this whistle in this enormously long train, but far from the, what do you call it, where the train pulls up, you know.
Depot.
Pardon me?
Depot.
Like when a train pulls up in front and you step up to the train, what is the spot that the train pulls up? What is it? Platform. That's it. And you're far away from the platform. And I thought, oh, and they opened the doors of the cattle trains. Those were cattle trains. They opened the door. You could see the German soldiers, you know, guards and so, and you know, you could see the Russians coming down, and I realized, watching them from far away, that basically they had water faucets there, and that the people were allowed to get some water. So you had basically to cross an enormous, quite a distance in order to reach those cattle cars, the cattle cars. And I decided that's it. I'm not even looking back. If somebody catches me or shoots me or so, that's fine. I just crossed, and until I reached where I tried to watch. Of course, that the sentry was walking back and forth. I tried to watch that. They maybe were beyond where I was standing, and so anyway, I did succeed, and I crossed, and they were getting the water, and that's when I realized, I noticed getting the water. Everybody had some flask or so, and I didn't have anything, and so what I did is something I'm not proud of, but nevertheless something which was necessary and certainly didn't cause any bodily harm to anybody. But I just grabbed a bottle from some woman who was filling it up, and she started yelling in Russian at me, but I wanted a little bit to look like others. And by that, before I started marching in the opposite direction from her, along some other cattle cars, and then came, the whistles and the, hollering of the German soldiers, get up, auf, and so, and then the train started moving, and I was in one of those cattle cars, surrounded by the Russians. And, we sat on the floor, they had some food with them, I didn't have anything, or so, So anyway, we started moving, and I think the last time in Poland we stopped was in a town called Przemyśl, and that's spelled P-R-Z-E-M S with a sort of umlaut in L, also with a kind of a wave over it in Przemyśl. And that was the last stop before we entered Germany. And there we could go to the bathroom, and it was those public latrines, And all of a sudden I'm looking up, and this creature, she looked like something unbelievable, she had these big man's shoes and a big man's jacket with white thread, which is, looking like the Russians looked at that time. Nobody in Russia had anything, so you looked like the devil, and I didn't have any clothes. And she all of a sudden says, "Are you sure?" Look up, I wouldn't have recognized her at all, and I had still some semi-decent underwear or so. Anyway, so I realized that she was there on that train, on one of those, not in the same that I was, and that gal who told me that she and her boyfriend intend to go on that train. Whether it was in Przemyśl, I realized that, or whether it was when we then stopped to get our papers in Germany or so, where we were photographed, where this Arbeitsbuch comes
Can you
from.
tell me about that? Now, did you use your Jewish name to get this paper?
No, you couldn't. You would defeat it totally. How could you have used your Jewish name?
So what name did you use?
I used the name Kubasiuk. It was the way they spelled it is, I think, K-U-B-A-S-Y-K. But basically, I just, somehow I froze. And all the names from the literature or so just disappeared. And I gave this name. And only late later, when I started being introduced to other Russians, I discovered that that was a strange name. That would give me to a certain degree away. That I don't belong there with the other Russians. So what I decided to do is I chose another name, and I thought, well, nobody of them is going, if I move from, because the first place I worked was in coal mines, and I would have to look up in the Arbeitsbuch, or so maybe should I go and take it? No, okay. I think I worked there in 1943, maybe for a couple of months, and I thought, that as soon as from the coal mines, they moved me to a lumber yard, and that was with a lot of people and a lot of Russians in barracks, and so I decided that I better, now nobody's going to ask me to show them the German Arbeitsbuch, I better have a different name, and I chose a different one, and so I started and that was a little bit better.
What was your new name?
My new name was Tarasova, Tarsowa. As it turned out, from going from a very strange name, it turns out this is a very prominent name in Russian circles. I discovered that the previous hockey coach of the Russians was a Tarasov, and the place is full of also. Well, anyway.
Did you speak Russian?
Yes, I spoke some, but of course not, fluently as some. I spoke somebody who had Russian lessons for a year and a half or something. I didn't speak, a fluent
And did anybody
Russian.
suspect you of being Jewish?
You tried not to mingle too much, You tried to sort of. It was a very precarious existence because you were basically that time you then slept in barracks with all the Russians, and I remember, like I mentioned in Ternopil when I was in gymnasium, the kind of hostile environment. Here it was also very dangerous. If I remember having the enormous pressure, I thought, oh dear Lord, what would happen if I got sick and I had fever and I started talking in Polish or something, and so you had to be really on the alert 24 hours a day, and that was,
How did the Germans treat the Russians that you were
like any slave labor? There was no, you got a little bit sloppy something in the morning, and you got maybe like 1.5 inch slice of bread, which was supposed to last you all day. And otherwise, you were doing you would carry the wood here or there, and there was, if you mean, was there beating or anything like that? Not that I saw of. No, it was just the starvation. And in my case, the danger, because I also didn't say, saying that I was Russian, I wanted to say also that I was coming from Russia, So I gave a name of a town called Vinica, and I remember, one Sunday or so, some people from the camp said, "Oh, Sonia, there is somebody from Vinica. There are people from Vinica here, from some other camp came visiting." Well, that was the end of that, because, of course, I never saw the town and I never knew anything. Plus, I remember like one day in that Holzhandlung in the lumber yard or so, I get up in the morning and I noticed, people coming to each other and kissing each other on both cheeks, and they are saying something. I think, dear Lord, I have not the vaguest, something is going on, I have not the vaguest idea what's going on. See, there is a danger also, every culture has their own things, so it's those things that can give you so easily away. So anyway, I thought something, but I had to go to work. I couldn't, this was not like evening or a free day, like when they said on a Sunday somebody is from Vinica. And finally, I heard two women, and they were a little bit louder than the others, and it turned out what they were saying is it was Easter time. What they were saying is Christ is risen, and the other one was supposed to answer, he is risen indeed. So that's what it was all about. But it's these things that made the tension of survival, it's the little customs that each country has and does. So
were you and any of the other Russians aware of the progress of the war at all?
Not much. No, not much. I know, I know we were always delighted when there was bombing going on, and as a matter of fact, I remember that one time when my son was at Andover, and I subscribed to the Philippian, which was their paper, and some Nobel Prize winner came to, whether it was biology or microbiology or whatever, came to talk to them. He started talking about the war and the cruelties we committed in the dreadful bombing of Dresden and other countries that was against humanitarian beliefs of the United States. And he said, if you were there, how do you think if you were there as a prisoner or somebody or a war, how would you have felt that way? And I remember writing a letter, I said, with all due respect to the North, we were elated when the bombing was going on, because we felt that in the last analysis we all going, be killed, so at least this might maybe precipitate the end of the war, so.
Okay, we're going to stop for the next tape here.
Okay.
This is an interview with Sonia Vanderhorst. This is tape number 4. Can you tell me elaborate about the slave labor team that you were with, and what major cities of Germany were you working in that you know of?
There was no major cities. I worked first, I think that coal mine was in Ibbenbüren, spelled IBBENBU, with the umlaut REN, first in Ibbenbüren, and I think I worked there for 2 months. And then in that, now the Holzhandlung, I always get stuck in that word, the lumberyard. And then in the lumberyard, I think also for 2 months more or less, and no. Yes, and then I think I worked. They put in the workbook. They put house help, but basically what I was working in is what do you call it? In scrap, like in scrap. So what I had to do housework too, but that was sort of in the late afternoons and part evenings. But I had to sort linen from wool, from cotton, this sort of thing. So I worked there for a while, and then I think I worked on a farm, not like the enormous farm like I worked in Poland and Berezowicz, but you know, a substantial farm, but not really, you know, big farm. And so I learned, you know, to milk cows, and you know, started the day like also 4:30, 5 o'clock, cleaning up the stalls and things like that. I worked there for a while, and then at the second farm until the end of the war, and that was in Kattenfenne, spelled Kattenvene. And that was all in the county of Westphalen, in the region of Westphalen with the coals, with the coal mines and coal side. Well, anyway, so I worked there, and that was also, you know, you had enough to eat, obviously, at the farmer, so that was very good. They also had Russian prisoners working on that farm, I remember, but you were totally isolated, basically, because, you know, didn't have any radio, and they listened among themselves, but you knew from the bombing. And so I do remember the Dresdner bombing. The Dresdner bombing, I remember because the people from the scrap, the woman, because her husband was in France as a soldier or officer or whatever, but I remember that it's her sister-in-law and brother-in-law or so came from Dresden, and I also remember, you know, hearing it even that far. It was, I remember them coming. But otherwise, the only thing was, despite the fact that I had enough to eat or so, I suffered all during the war from enormous boils. And I had constantly boils. And at the last farmers, I remember that they sent me finally had to send me to a physician, to a German physician. It was a woman physician, and she thought that I had to go to the hospital to have it opened.
Who sent you to the physician, the German civilian farmer?
Yes, the German, because it was becoming very bad. So I went there, and she sent me, and I think I went on a bicycle, and you know, and I remember the hospital was in Osnabrück. It's spelled Osnabrbu with the umlaut CK in Osnabrück, and then they opened my breast.
You were allowed to ride your bicycle alone there, there?
Well, who was going to take the time to bring me, you know, so that's, I can't remember. I know I rode the bicycle to the German doctor. I can't remember whether I rode a bicycle all the way to Osnabrück. It seems to me I did, because I couldn't have gone on a train. It seems I had to ride. It was quite an ordeal, I remember that. And so I had terrible problems with boils all during the war. Part of the time I understood it, of course, tension and tremendous hunger, but at the farmers I didn't have any hunger, so it must have been just enormous stress. And so,
was this the farm that you were on when you were liberated?
yes, and I didn't even know that the war was over, but I had during part of the time, like when I was in coal mines and when I was at this lumber yard, if I became friends, or she became friends with me. It later turned out that either her father or mother was Jewish, but I never told her about me being Jewish, but we shared we tried also to get bunk beds together when we were, in that lumberyard or so. But of course we were separated when I don't know whether she went to a farmer, but anyway I was transferred to farmers, but whether one way or another we managed to keep tab on each other through other people who were transferred from work, and they say, oh, I saw Zoya or something. I don't remember that. But anyway, one good day she arrives at the farmer's house and she says, what are you doing here? I said, what do you mean what I'm doing here? She said, the English are here. We've been liberated. Come. So, so I said, where are we going? She said, well, the first displaced person camp is in Graven, Westfalen. That was in Westfalen too. And so I went to Graven, and there indeed were the English were there, and Russian slave labor people were arriving in droves from other, camps and things. There were also some Dutchmen and some Belgian, I remember, and I'm trying to think whether there was a smattering of French or whether it was just some Belgian-speaking, some French-speaking Belgians, and also regular Flemish-speaking Belgians.
Was this a DP camp at
Yes.
Graven?
This is what they call a DP, which is of course displaced persons camp. And so then you had to register your name and this, and I decided that I needed some work to be among what I consider normal people, because I knew that I was that I couldn't possibly have witnessed all the ravages of the ghetto and the terrible things, and have some stability in my emotions or my mind. I don't think I ever regained any emotional stability. But anyway, and then you needed to look for a place to live. They assigned, just like in that was not a too big town, Graven, and they assigned in some places, rooms.
What name did you register yourself?
Tarasova.
Your Russian assumed name.
Yeah, I kept sort of with that. I don't know, it's sort of, don't ask me why, but there are many questions. They don't make any sense to me at all now, and they probably didn't make any sense. It would need a psychiatrist, to unravel it, and a good one. So anyway, and then for a while with all these people streaming in, they had me write out all the names and the people's kind of, so that they had the list who was coming in of the slave labor into Graven. That drove me crazy. I found it so monotonous and so boring that I went and I said, no, I just can't do that. And so I said, well, what can you do? I said, well, I'm good in languages, and I was. My only problem was that I couldn't speak English, and that was the most important language. But I sort of figured out that if I say that I can, and even though they find out that I can't, they sort of maybe think, well, surely has some nerve, and so maybe there is something to the gal. And indeed, it exactly happened the way I saw it. It seems to me that the next day, so the English officer, somebody said, well, that I will translate, and the English officer came and started with the word, I think. And that was the end of that, because obviously it's an abstract thing, you know. So, and indeed it happened. So they kept me on because there were quite a bit of Russian officers, or so they kept me for translating, you know, from German to Russian, and from French to Russian and things like that. And so I did a certain amount of that. In the meantime, in May, I think begin May, my husband, my future husband at that time, he joined the American forces in unoccupied France and fought with the American forces and was wounded. And then there came a decree from the Americans that foreigners had to leave the American army. I think it was, at least that's the way he explained it, and it does make sense, and I wouldn't be surprised that that was the reason. That of course, if he would have been killed or something, there would have been probably a pension or damages, and they didn't want that obligation.
What country was he from?
He was from Holland, from the Netherlands.
Oh, what was his name?
His name was, official name was Johannes Martinus Arnold van der Horst, but he was called Hans van der Horst. So anyway, he went to Paris, and they were organizing the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Forces, so he joined them, and he came to Graven as a supply officer, and that's when we met. And he felt he was really multilingual and extremely fluent and very good at it. Never needed to search for a word, and so he decided that he needed some Russian lessons, and I felt I could use some English lessons. So that's how we came to know each other. And, you know, that went on a very formal basis. We never went out particularly, only any discussions or so which we had was during the lessons or incorporating it, some of our ideas and things. And then the time came where all these displaced persons had to go to their home of origin, back to their homes. And the last thing I wanted to go back is to Poland. I wouldn't have been too badly off in Russia. My only problem was that being such an outspoken person, I'm not a good person to submit without questioning to authority, and having lived under the Russian occupation for practically 2 years, I knew that I'm not going to last there, no matter, you know, what my standard of living would have been. So I went to the people in the military government, and I said, you know, the Russians is leaving, I would really like to try my luck in the West. And they said, yes, we will help you, and we would help you kind of disappear for a couple of days, because the Russians still had me like they had their list, and I became by that time like practically a Russian #1, so I would have had to go, you know, underground. And in the meantime, I I caught a severe cold or so, and Hans came he knew that the transport would be leaving with the Russians. He came and he said, we visited a little bit and how I feel, and then I said, well, if life was different, we probably would have remained good friends. As it is, we probably won't see each other ever again. At which time he said, why don't you marry me? And I said, well, why not? I didn't necessarily use my head completely, though instinctively I was used to judge people on impulse, and most of the time my judgment, luckily for me, was correct. I knew, that I liked what he stood for, what things were important for him. I liked his looks, and so I said, yes, all right. Plus, having still lived under that sort of reigning in the war, you don't stop immediately. I said, well, if it doesn't work out, I will look for something else or so. But of course, with my background, you don't look for something else, and as it turns out, it was not necessary to look for something else because he was a much better person than I was.
So you were married then?
No, first of all, I had to go back to the military government to tell them, that I appreciate their help, but I don't need them. So the guy in charge of the English said, well, I don't believe you or so. So I went back to Hans. I said, Hans, you have to come. And he said, yes, it is so. And well, anyway, then, so Hans then took over, and I remember going into some place into hiding for 2 or 3 days until the Russian transports got back. Went back to Russia. And so then he came back and he said, well, maybe I can get some leave and we can get married in Brussels. So we arrived in Brussels, and in Brussels it turns out when we went to the Dutch consulate that until you were 30 years old you needed the permission of your parents, or at least one of your parents. Well, Hans was 27 years old or so. So we didn't have the permission. I couldn't go to Holland because I wasn't Dutch, and I couldn't become Dutch because Hans wasn't 30 years old. So it became kind of one of those nightmarish things, but Hans was he had his devious side. So we first went to the Polish consulate, and that was the first time I used my real name, Eichenbaum or so, and said that, would he type up there, the officer there in the consulate, that Johannes Martinus Arnold Vanderhorst and Mrs. I don't know whether I kept Sonia or Gaia Eichenbaum intend to get married, and that was typed up in Polish. So then he went to the Dutch consulate and said, well, this is a marriage certificate and so on. I think the Dutch consul, the Dutch are very liberal and always very helpful. The pilgrims left from Holland, and they still are that way. I think he sort of could figure it out, but wanted to be helpful. So anyway, we stayed like 3 days in Belgium, and the only thing I remember is Hans taking me to see a Marx Brothers movie. And I remember the pace was so fast. I think it was a night in the opera, and half of it I didn't understand, but he was absolutely delighted with it. And so anyway, then we got to Holland, and that was in August. And once we got to Holland, then I couldn't get married because I didn't have any papers. I didn't have any documentation saying that I am I. So it took kind of some doing in that area. Hans's mother got a few friends or so saying that they knew me or whatever it was. I think you needed 4 witnesses or so, and finally on October 11th we got married.
This is 1945?
1945. And in the meantime, Hans was still in the UNRWA, and I could not go with him because that was considered occupied territory, and you didn't bring wives there. So I stayed with Hans's mother. Hans's father was in Holland, in America, and with Hans's brother and sister-in-law and Hans's sister. So I stayed in the house with them, and every 3 months Hans would come on leave. And it was not simple. I started, try to learn Dutch lessons and so, and then I thought enough of that. I'm getting tired. It was a relatively formal household, and I was just, my mind wasn't on pouring tea to bridge ladies at that time and making small conversation. So I decided, even though I was not allowed to come to Germany, that I'm going finagle and go illegally somehow to Germany. Well, my unmarried sister-in-law said, if you go, I would like to go with you. So I said, fine. So we decided to go to the border, to some small village, and we thought maybe we find somebody, some farmer or somebody who could take us across the border or so. And I remember as today, there was carnival in town. So we went to like a place to have tea or some coffee house or whatever. You could have beer there too or so. And the place was jammed, and that's how we discovered that the carnival was in town. So I said, what are we going to say? And my sister-in-law said, she said, we're going to say, if somebody asks us or something, we're going to say we're with the carnival, we're trapeze artists. She said, nobody's going to have a trapeze right here and there or with animals. So anyway, to make a long story short, that time it didn't work out. So we back to Hilversum, where I lived, and Hans's family lived. And the second time we tried it was through the parents of a close friend of Hans from the university time, and that we succeeded. And we came to Graven, where Hans was still there, but the town, there was a bridge in Graven, and that was bombed out, so even though it was one town, you couldn't cross because the town was divided. So anyway, we went someplace in, and I called Hans, and he said, where are you? And I said, well, I'm right here. So he was delighted, kind of, that woman, but he was delighted to see us, obviously, and took us in. And then I knew that the friend who was saying that she was going on a slave labor, trying to get on a slave labor camp, I don't know whether I left her the address or how it all came about, but she was waiting for her papers through, I think it was the United Jewish Appeal, and she was in one of the, name some of the camps, the concentration camp, Bergen-Belsen. She was in Bergen-Belsen, so I said, well, I'm going to go and visit Nusha in Bergen-Belsen. When I came to Bergen-Belsen, there were, all kinds of people there, and there were also people from Israel recruiting, volunteers who would want to go to Israel, even though illegally, at that time they had those boats, and so. so, you know, they talked to me, and I thought, gee, it's my obligation, you know, to go to Israel and to help, you know, start the country. So I said, well, that sounds like a good idea. So I came back to Hans, and I said, well, you know, I'm thinking maybe I should go for a year to Israel and, you know, help there build the country. And Hans, of course, realized that it's an off-the-wall idea, you know, him sitting here and me sitting there. So before you know, I was pregnant, and that took care of that.
So how long was it before you came to America?
Came to America in 1952. I always remained very jittery in Europe. You know, now we're
Okay, we need to stop.
Yeah.
This.